Thank you for joining us today for Armchair Historians. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Cannon. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. You can also find us at armchairhistorians.com. Also, won't you consider becoming a patron of the show? In an effort to keep Armchair Historians commercial-free, I have decided to work with Patreon. Now, if you mosey on over to www.patreon.com/armchairhistorians, that's historians with an S, you can find out more about supporting the show and about exclusive patron content that you will have access to. You can chip in anywhere from $1 to $15 a month or just make a one-time donation. You will be helping me to keep the lights on. And if you can't make a donation, that's totally cool. I just hope you will continue to listen to our free podcast. And stay with us till the end. You don't want to miss our Kid Wisdom segment where we talk to 13-year-old Emerald about some very weighty history. Today we are talking to Manuel, host of Random History of Belgium podcast, a history podcast that looks at events, companies, people, and the culture of Belgium. Through his podcast, Manuel informs, educates, and entertains his listeners by explaining random parts of history, ranging from playing cards, the Belgian royal family, to food in World War II, and much more. Manuel, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Glad to be here. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Glad to be invited here.
So I found you online because I love podcasts. I listen to podcasts. And since I've had time on my hands during the pandemic, I have been working on 2 podcasts myself. And one of them is really focused on Belgian history. It's called Last Train Leaving Belgium. It's about my mother and about her experience with World War II. You know, in the bigger scope, it's about children being caught in the crossfire of war, specifically in Belgium. So I landed on your podcast. The first one I listened to was the one about the resistance because I had an aunt that was actually in the resistance. I interviewed her daughter. Unfortunately, Tante Renee has passed away. But so anyways, so I'm interested to know a lot of things, but one of the things we ask in my podcast, Armchair Historians, is what's your favorite history? And I have no idea what you're going to say.
Whoa, what's your favorite history? That's actually a tough question. I am interested in, of course, Belgian history. Otherwise, I wouldn't do a podcast about it. But on the other hand, I came into this being interested in the Roman Empire, actually. And I'm forgetting his name, Mike Duncan, who is a bit of the gold standard of history podcasting, and he had the history of Rome. So I started to listen to that, but in general, I like any history with an intriguing story behind it, or connections to other parts of history. For example, if you examine French or Belgian history, you sometimes see that it's interconnected with the US, for example, and other things that happens around the world. So I like those interconnections, and I don't actually focus that much on the country or a specific person or a date. For me, the meaning behind the story and why it's played out that way is much more important than having every small detail right.
And that's kind of where I'm coming from with this podcast, is talking to people who, you know, like history, who like to talk about history. They don't have to be historians. Mm-hmm. 2 weeks ago, I talked to a YouTube celebrity about their favorite history. So, you know, it's really about the engagement with another person, and this is perfect.
I agree there.
Well, let's focus on Belgian history then. And how you got into that, into your podcast. I'm really curious about your process and how that all came about. I read somewhere that you said, I was just going to do 6 episodes.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I was interested in listening to podcasts. I listened to a lot of them, and of all kinds of different subjects, be it politics, science, whatever. And at one moment, I thought, okay, I want to do something. I write short stories, and I thought, okay, I will write some short stories, make it episodical, and do something online with a podcast. That was like 5 years ago. And I thought, okay, I have to learn that medium first, and okay, let's grab something that's interesting as well, but let's just do 6 episodes about a story. And then I thought, why not Belgian history? Let's take 6 or 5 important moments in Belgian history and do six episodes about that. And well, I'm 109 episodes further down the road, because yeah, once you dive into something like that, it's getting more interesting and interesting. And also, I didn't learn that much about Belgian history in Belgian schooling.
Oh, that's surprising.
It's strange maybe, but we learned about Roman Empire, about the Greek, about we of course saw something about our own country, but not that much actually.
Well, and I think your podcast is such a valuable resource for Belgian history, and you cover so many different topics. One of my favorite radio shows is Fresh Air with Terry Gross. I don't know if you've ever listened to her.
I don't know it that well.
Okay. Well, I've always really admired her because she can take any guest and make it interesting. And one of the things I think about is this, she did a show on banana blights, and it was a researcher that wrote a book about banana blights. And it was one of the most fascinating shows I've ever heard of. I've ever heard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care about bananas, I don't care about blights, but it's the way she asked the questions. And you did a show about chicory,
Yeah.
and it had the same impact on me as the banana blights. And part of it is because my mom used to
Coffee.
mix chicory with our coffee, and
Yeah.
she was Belgian, so
That might
it's
come back.
it could, yeah. She used to cut the coffee to save money. She's from the war and the depression and all that, but so I love that you're so thorough in the topics that you pick, and you must spend a lot of time researching. Is that true?
It depends, of course, on the subject. Some subjects are pretty easy to research and really fun. Others are a bit more elaborate, and then you have to, well, find some resources that are interesting enough to talk about it a bit longer. But I like doing that research. Unfortunately, in these days, we have to do it purely online, but there are some libraries here where you can request access to microfilm archives of newspapers and so on. That's really interesting, and I would love to do that actually full time. If I had the means to do so, I would just do that for fun all the time. And it's
Do research and do your podcast?
yeah, indeed, I would do
Um,
that.
so this is just a side gig.
Indeed. About podcasting, I want to add there that it's a choice for me to not do the podcast with ads or anything like that, because I sometimes hear history podcasting doing that too much, and
Mhm.
it distracts enormously. And also, you are informing people about something, and it just doesn't fit for me. But I totally respect people doing it, and I know why, because it earns some income. But I really am a fan of people just donating. If they like the show, they can donate. If they don't like the show or don't want to donate, it's fine for me. But of course, it's part of the motivation as well. If no one would ever donate and you do 109 episodes, then it's pretty bad actually. Then it's like, okay, is there no one in the world even wanting to spend $1 on what I do here? So fortunately enough, that's not the case. But on the other hand, I really do this out of motivation for myself. Even if it's a side gig, it's okay for me, and I like to do it. But yeah, if you're in podcasting for the money, you're in the wrong business, I think. Say
Yeah,
for a
I'm a
few
writer, and
celebrities, maybe.
it's the same thing in writing, so I
Writing,
have
same
to,
thing, absolutely.
yeah. Yeah, I hear you. So yeah, and I'm grappling with all that right now. I don't really have enough followers at this point to
Yeah,
do
no problem.
commercials, but I don't really want to do commercials because
Hmm.
you're right. It's like, I have to sell something that I might not believe in, or I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
Or in the
fine,
middle
but
of the story, you switch to saying how wonderful dog cookies are, or whatever. It's like it doesn't always fit. If it's a good product, maybe. If it's really a
maybe,
good
yeah.
product that fits what you're talking about in the history podcast, then you might do it. Let's say um, some publisher says, okay, we have a series of books on Belgian history. We want you to promote that. That fits. And no one will complain about that, I think. But in general, no,
I'm with
I
you.
always
I'm
don't do
with
it.
you. I'm new
Yeah.
to this, but I'm with you. So I'm trying to figure it all out. It would be nice to be able to support the show through, Patreon or whatever. I
Hmm.
noticed that you do Patreon, you do just donations, you do buy me a cup of coffee, uh, and that whole thing. I'll put all that information up too because it's definitely a worthwhile show and product, and I support it. So there's that. And I'm curious to know how you choose the topics. Like, are you already planning your next show? How are you choosing a topic?
Hmm.
What's your next topic? I was listening to the last episode, which had to do with, and I'm going to say it wrong, something like the white
March.
march. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have no frame of reference for that. And I was cooking dinner and I thought, I can't listen to this unless I have access to a computer because I don't understand a lot of the references. And,
Okay.
I want to know all the stories and, what it's
Mm.
about. But I mean, it's
Okay.
fascinating.
Okay, so about first of all about the title of that episode, I thought about that to just name it the Dutroux case because that's what it's actually about. But that would attract the wrong kind of attention, I think, because I don't want to put a flashy title with that person's name on it because, well, he's one of our famous killers and one of the biggest cases we ever had here in Belgium. So, but I wanted to do an episode on that. I just finished the follow-up episode, and it's maybe like you say, the frame of reference. If you missed that. Then you need a computer actually to search for that. But that's my bad. I sometimes am rather chaotic in telling stories, and that's the way I am. And that's why it's also the random history of Belgium and not the chronological history of Belgium.
Okay, that
Otherwise,
explains a
it would
lot.
be a mess anyway. If I do it chronologically or not, I am that I want to tell so many things at the same time, and I really have to compartmentalize it and bring it piece by piece. And choosing a title, choosing the next subject, it's a very strange process. Actually, I have a list of over 300 subjects and I just pick one that I feel like, okay, this is what I can do now. It's also depending on what I have access to. So, for example, if there's an interesting work that I come across and I can take some data from there and I can cross-reference it with other things, sometimes it just falls on your lap. Otherwise, it's just like, okay, I'm just gonna do something about, let's say, a painter, Adriaan Brouwer, which I think is one of the best painters, or his works are really beautiful. So, okay, I just dive in there and I see what I can get. And some episodes just don't make it because the subject is not interesting enough or the sources dry up or whatever. So yeah, it's and there are also episodes that are taking a very very long time to prepare. Just to give you an example, I have a follow-up episode on the resistance movements, and I wanted to do the other side of that, so the collaboration with the Germans. And of
Wow, that
course,
sounds fascinating.
you open a box of Pandora, certainly in Belgium, because you have different kinds of collaboration. It's a mess. And I'm working together with some guys who do the Germany podcast, the History of Germany podcast, to look at it from their side as well,
Oh,
because they have
cool.
other
I love
sources.
that.
So, but that takes, of course, more than a month to put together. So it will take time. And well, it's not like doing something about Belgian fries, for example, where you can just find resources enough and put it together quite easily. But
That's
it's
fascinating. I didn't realize I listened to your is there one episode about the resistance so far in World War II?
yeah, there's only one because there was not that much time to put that one together actually, but I wanted to do a second one on the resistance, specifically on their sabotage actions, and that's still stranded. I
Yeah.
have too much
Well, I think
resources.
that's interesting, and I respect that you're looking from both sides. And I didn't realize all the nuance in the resistance period.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. What's often forgotten there is that the communists were actually the backbone of that. That's often overlooked because they were not liked that much further down the road, or they gained too much power, something in between probably. But Belgium on itself as a country has so many nuances, and certainly during the two world wars. Okay, let me tell you this. There is this the Flemish movement, for example, where there is the democratic part and the less democratic part. I don't want to approach history like I have an opinion on any of those guys. Personally, I have, and I can tell you I don't like the undemocratic guys, but that's me as a person. Me as the author of the podcast, I really don't care. I want to know those stories, and I will talk to people who are really on that side. And I want to know, okay, what's the nuance, because that's part of our history. But it's subtle. It's in Belgium. It's really difficult to map all that because they immediately think that you have a political motive to do that, and that's the tricky part here.
Interesting. Wow. See, I feel like I could talk to you for hours, and I know that we only have a little bit of time left, but maybe we can schedule another time to
Yeah, of
talk.
course. And I like to talk a really long time about different subjects. It's all okay, certainly if it's history. But I have a question also for you.
Oh,
Your
good.
last
I
train,
love to
yeah.
talk.
But it's interesting to see your podcast is about the last train from Belgium.
Hmm.
So it's how the children, the impact on the children, how they are treated, and how they are pulled on to these political ongoings at that moment, and what can we
It's
expect
really
there?
specifically about my mother and my aunt and other
Okay.
members of my family who were children when the war broke out. But my mother was born in Belgium. She was 7 years old when the Germans invaded. But part of telling that story is I have to reflect back to World War I, where her family was
Mhm.
massacred in Neuf. You know Neuf?
Oh, yeah, that was
And I don't know if you are familiar with the Aqueduct massacre in Neuf in World War One.
I know there was a massacre, well, more massacres, but that was one of the biggest ones because they took revenge for yeah, okay. I'm
It
not
was
gonna
not
tell
a
it
good
because I
thing.
don't know
But
the exact.
the reason why that story is important is because my mother they lived in Palisol. Her father had to go to France. He was in the French military. And so she had to go live with her grandmother who lived in right in front of that aqueduct. And there's a monument in front of that aqueduct that it was her aunt who had erected. And her aunt Adele Oubion Charlier, her family she was in her basement with my third great grandfather, and the rest of her family was in the aqueduct, and she lost half of her family in that massacre. So this has been a narrative in the family history,
Mhm.
and I believe wholeheartedly that we carry our histories, whether they're known or unknown. Whether I don't know if it's a genetic thing or if it's that we carry it through the subtlety of behavior, passed down
Mhm.
from parents, and that's a whole other topic. But so my mother would go to visit her grandmother, and this family legend, was deep in her psyche. And then she had to go live with her grandmother. The Germans are coming again. She's already scared of the Germans.
Mhm.
And it's that story. So I just sum it up by saying
Yeah.
children caught in the crossfires of war, because I have to have like a one sentence kind of elevator
Yeah.
speech. And so that's where that is from.
Wow. That's actually a story to follow. Have many facets to it and many
Yeah, it does. And
stories.
and I guess what I realized when I went to Belgium with my mother in 2012, and we went to all the places. I filmed her,
Mhm.
so a lot of the footage is from her, but also my grandfather was a photographer. He was always on the cutting edge of film, and he would make these little family silent films, like just like a Charlie Chaplin film. So I have all that footage, which is really, valuable,
Okay.
and it's adding a lot of dimension to the story. But we went back there, and I guess I had an epiphany when I was at the monument there in front of the aqueduct, and that was the psyche of not just my mother, who was not alive during World War One, but all the people that were alive during World War One. And oh my God, here they come again. And what that did to them, and why so many people clogged up the streets, and the
Mhm.
Germans were able to use that as a kind of a weapon against what we would call the Allied forces.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of dimension. There's a lot of nuance. And also, I want to utilize my platform in Last Train Leaving Belgium as an opportunity to shine light. I think of my mother as she was a refugee of war. She was a child, and there's a lot of children today that are still impacted by that. So I'm
Mhm.
partnering with some charities. War Child is one of them, and I'm going to utilize that platform to, shine a light on, this is happening in the world. I'm also learning a lot from these organizations, because it's helping me to understand who my mother was and why she was the way she was. She was a tough
Mhm.
woman, but she survived a lot too.
Wow.
So that's that story. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, but it's fascinating because what you say, the roads were at that moment blocked because so many people all started to, well, flee at the same time. And that was partly because what they remembered or their parents remembered about World War One
Totally.
and what happened there. And the fear of the Germans was also known on the other side. They knew, like, okay, we have to treat them more humanly this time because otherwise everyone will start fighting us, even normal citizens who would, well, stir up stuff. And they explicitly did, well, not that they were kind, but it was not on the level of World War One when they invaded Belgium, specifically for that reason.
Yeah, I interviewed a guy named Jeff Lipkes. He wrote a book, Rehearsals, and it really was a culmination of people's experiences. And my aunt, Adele, my great aunt, her account was in that book, and that's how I found him. He said he wanted to set the record straight, because there's still people today who believe that what happened wasn't as bad as they said it was. They said it was propaganda. The rape of Belgium was all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so he was a professor, and he came across all this material, and he wrote this book, and I recommend it. But he was a guest on my show. He talks about that. He talks about the German military was told to watch what you do and to not repeat what
Mhm.
happened in World War One. But having said that, the psychological impact, I think, was already, fostered inside of people. And so
That's true.
it was kind of a weapon. And we do talk about, there is a lot of gray areas. There is a story in the documentary. I'm talking too much. I want to be talking to you. Um, We're going to stop here for today, but be sure to join us next week for part 2 of the interview. Be sure to stay with us for our Kid Wisdom segment, where we talk to 13-year-old Emerald from Idaho Springs, Colorado. I'm going to share a small clip of the interview that I had with Emerald last week, but I've decided it was such a powerful interview. In a couple weeks, I will release it in full as the headline interview for an episode of Armchair Historians. So, what is your favorite history?
I think my favorite history to learn and talk about would be World War II.
Okay.
It's most interesting to me, and I just like to learn about it.
So, what is it about World War II that draws you in? Like, what is it that you find most interesting?
I think it's interesting that Hitler just thought that those ideas were good, and that all of that just happened because of one person and his ideas, and how it destroyed so many lives and families, and what it did to the history and how people look at like Germany and how people judge things.
Mm-hmm. So you said how Hitler could do those things. Could you be more specific about those things?
Yeah, like hate on the Jews and how how he had such an impact, like how all the Nazis, they took Jews, they took people with disabilities, and they killed them for them being them,
Mm-hmm.
just because they were Jews, just because they had disabilities. They thought that everything had to be perfect, and so they would kill and destroy the things that weren't, or weren't the way that they had it. So the things he did were like, he just took people and thought that they were just things.
Mm-hmm.
He treated them as things, not people.
Right, right. That's
And
pretty heavy, Emerald. I feel like crying while I'm listening to you. And there's two reasons for that. And one is because of what you're talking about. It's really painful. Whew. And just because you are thinking about these things and they matter to you and that you've given thought to them. So I'm really impressed with that. And it's heavy. It's emotionally heavy.
yeah, I don't really know too much about World War II, but it still affects me because I still hear about it. I still learn about it, and even though it happened so many years ago, it's still a part of people's lives. So I think it's pretty interesting at how it's still in people's heads about what happened and why that happened.
Do you think it could happen again?
I don't think that exactly could happen again, but I do think some people in this world still have ideas like that,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe at some point somewhere in the world those ideas are going through their head and it's maybe happening.
So,
Like,
like ideas, I'm making an assumption, but I'm going to clarify with you. People who are, for instance, racist, who
yeah,
believe that somehow they're better because they're a certain skin color. People who believe that certain types of people, like gay and lesbians, that type of thing, like they're wrong and they shouldn't exist and that they're sinning and that type. Is that what you're talking about?
yeah, yeah. And there's so many people out there now that are queer, LGBTQ
Mm-hmm.
plus, and there's also so many people who think that it's super wrong and that there should be something done about it. But and those ideas, they could be going through somebody's head, and they could actually occur in some places, and they have.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still going through people's heads with the same ideas as Hitler, but
Right.
Hitler's was just way bigger, and it affected the whole world.
We're going to stop there. That was really heavy. It's a very small portion of the interview that I did with Emerald, and I feel like I owe it to her and to everybody who listens to my podcast to share the whole interview with you. So be looking for that in a few weeks. Be sure to join us next week when we talk to the host of Random History of Belgium, Manuel, for part 2 of that interview. I'll leave information about that podcast in the episode notes. Also, remember to check out our Patreon page, as well as keep up to date with the latest Armchair Historians news on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.